Last summer, I decided to take on a major section of Pacific Crest Trail, a famous trail that stretches through the Sierra Nevada mountain range, where nature's raw beauty and mysteries draw adventurers. I've always loved hiking, especially solo trips, as they allow me to be immersed in nature without distractions. The trail was known for its breathtaking views, lush forests, and serene landscapes, a perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of daily life. My plan was simple: park my car at the end of the section, hitch a ride to the trailhead, and then hike back. The first few days went smoothly, just as I had hoped. The trail stretched endlessly through towering trees, winding paths, and quiet valleys. The air was fresh, and the feeling of isolation was comforting. But little did I know that the peacefulness would soon turn into a nightmare. At first, everything was perfect. The trail was smooth, and the surroundings were exactly as I had imagined. An oasis of tranquility. Despite hiking alone, I always kept my guard up. Every night, I set up camp in secluded spots off the trail to avoid attracting attention. The nights were peaceful, and the sounds of the forest were my only companions. But on the third night, a strange feeling began to settle in. On the third night, I woke up in the middle of the night with an odd feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't the sound of animals or any obvious danger. It was an instinctive gut feeling. I looked around inside my tent. Everything seemed fine, but the sense of unease didn't go away. Something was off. I decided to step outside and check my surroundings. As soon as I unzipped the tent, a cold gust of wind hit my face. I grabbed my rifle, turned on my flashlight, and stepped outside. The night was still, the trees casting long shadows in the dim light. There was no one in sight. I checked around a campsite and returned to my tent. But as I started organizing my gear, I noticed something strange. My wallet was missing. At first, I thought I had misplaced it, maybe left it outside the tent or buried in my bag. But after thoroughly checking everything, it was clear someone had taken it. All my personal information, cash, credit cards, all gone. How could this happen? Had someone snuck into my tent to steal just that one item and leave? It seemed unlikely, but it didn't make sense that I could misplace it. I was deeply unsettled. Something was wrong, and I knew it. The next day, I noticed even more items gone. A lighter, my Swiss Army knife, a few energy bars, all mysteriously disappeared. I couldn't just keep brushing it off as simple forgetfulness. It was obvious. Someone was stealing my things. By the fourth day, I had no doubt I was being stalked. But in that part of the trail, there was no cell coverage. I couldn't call for help. I thought about turning back, but that would only save me a couple of days. I couldn't hike either direction without needing rest, but how could I sleep with someone stalking me in these woods? It felt like a no-win situation. I remained calm and reassured myself that there was a reason I had brought my rifle. But then I realized something. Why hadn't they taken my gun? It was almost as if they were toying with me. That night, I tied my tent shut from the inside, hoping it would keep anyone from getting in if they returned. I stayed awake as long as I could, but eventually, exhaustion overcame me and I fell asleep. The next morning, there was no sign anyone had been in my tent, but the paranoia had already set in. I couldn't shake the feeling of being constantly watched. Every step on the trail felt agonizing. I had never experienced anxiety like this before. My mind began to play tricks on me. A rustling in the bushes, nothing. A flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. Gone the moment I turned my head. The hallucinations began to worsen. I remember one particular moment that stands out. As I was walking, I stepped into an ankle-deep puddle of water that nearly made me trip. I distinctly heard the splash and felt the cold water soaking my sock. But when I looked down, the ground was completely dry. I stood there in shock, unable to understand what had just happened. It felt so real, but I had no choice but to keep moving down the trail. Despite the horrific days, the nights were even more unbearable. I tied my tent shut, slept next to my rifle, but nothing calmed my anxiety. At one point, I had to splash cold water on my face just to steady myself. The hallucinations mostly subsided after that, but I wasn't sure what I would have done if they hadn't. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps circling my campsite. I grabbed my rifle quietly, preparing to confront whoever it was. but my body was frozen in fear. The footsteps came closer and closer, and then, suddenly, they faded into the woods. There was no way I was going to sleep after that. As soon as the sun rose, I frantically packed my camp. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely tie up my gear. I couldn't stay out there another night. I was so close, probably a day and a quarter's hike away from my car. I decided I wouldn't stop to sleep that night. I would push through until I got out of the woods. The thought of spending another night in those haunted woods was unbearable. I hiked for hours, my body already exhausted, but I had to keep going. When the sun started to set, I gritted my teeth and kept moving. I didn't dare stop to pitch my tent. I was so close, just a couple more hours. My flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other, I continued, my heart racing, second-guessing my decision. I had never hiked in the dark before, and the thought of doing it now felt like an even greater challenge. But I had no choice. About an hour into the darkness, I heard it. Footsteps. I was certain of it. I spun around and flashed my light, and to my horror, I saw a figure dart behind a tree. The adrenaline surged, and I instinctively aimed my rifle at the tree, shouting for whoever was to come out. The figure stepped forward. It was a human. Barely. What I saw was the most barbaric thing I had ever witnessed. He was wearing nothing but a pair of my shorts, which I hadn't even realized were missing. His skin was scratched up, his face covered in hair. He started walking toward me, despite the rifle I had aimed at him. Before I could think, I fired a warning shot next to him. He jumped at the sound, his eyes wide with panic, and instantly retreated, sprinting back into the woods. I was in shock. Without wasting another second, I turned around and ran. I didn't stop until I reached my car. When I got in my car, I locked the doors and called the police. When they arrived, they told me I shouldn't stick around. I didn't need any more advice. I left that night. The worst part of the whole experience, in my opinion, were the hallucinations. I never thought such vivid hallucinations could occur. It's going to be a long time before I go hiking again. And when I do, I can confidently say I won't be alone. I would advise anyone planning to hike the Pacific Crest Trail to be extremely cautious and to carry a firearm. This experience is something I still think about every day. I never expected a simple hike to turn into a fight for survival, but in the end, it wasn't the physical dangers that haunted me most. It was the psychological terror, the fear that never left me. I need to apologize in advance if I get any details wrong, but this is a story my best friend told me many times, and every time I hear it, I still get chills. His father worked as a logger, but not just any logger. He operated a tree saw, this massive machine capable of cutting down towering trees in minutes. His job was grueling, often working alone in the deep, remote forests of Northern California. He wasn't paid by the hour, but by the number of trees he cut down. So he would often work 16 to 20-hour days, never stopping. Though he worked mostly alone, there were times when he worked with his friend Griffin. They communicated through radio, especially when working in separate areas of the job site. One day, several years ago, they were assigned a job in a remote location at the top of a mountain in Redwood National Park. To get there, the company took 3 weeks to clear a road wide enough for their trucks and equipment. By the time they arrived, they were deep in the wilderness, where no one could easily access. Soon after, strange voices began to crackle through their radios. At first, they were just faint static-laden murmurs, but over time, the voices became clearer. These weren't coherent conversations, just fragmented snippets that followed them no matter what channel they switched to. This was unsettling. My friend said the voices sometimes sounded casual, but when listened to closely, they felt off, like someone was watching them. The next day, as they began their work in the early morning, a feeling of unease washed over them. Both felt like someone was watching them from the shadows of the forest. The first sign was the strange markings they found. Odd footprints on the ground, clear but quickly disappearing. Empty containers, discarded gear, and signs of someone having lived there for a long period. One afternoon, while cutting trees, Griffin pointed out a strange new mark, a giant footprint, as if a massive person had walked through the area. My friend searched around but found nothing except the trees surrounding them. They continued their work, but from that moment on, a feeling of dread never left them. One day, Griffin stumbled upon a tent hidden off the trail. He called my friend over, and they decided to investigate. Inside, they found horrifying things: a single sleeping bag, a duffel bag filled with disturbing items, children's underwear, duct tape, rope, and crude sketches depicting unspeakable acts. There were even photos of a fresh apple, indicating the owner of the bag had been there recently. Griffin wanted to leave immediately, but my friend, always a workaholic, insisted they finish the job. Reluctantly, Griffin agreed. They decided to limit their radio communication to emergencies only. But that night, the sense of dread was so thick, it felt like the darkness surrounding them would never lift. The radio crackled again, this time clearer, and they could make out snippets of conversation from two men. The discussions were about nothing important: gathering water, collecting firewood. But soon, they realized these men were the ones from the tent. That made my friend uneasy, while Griffin just felt worried. The next day, my friend couldn't take it anymore. When he overheard the men talking about preparing firewood, he grabbed the radio and demanded to know who they were and what they were doing there. Silence followed, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. No response came, and that silence felt more unsettling than any noise. Griffin was furious that my friend had exposed their position, but there was no time for arguing. The next night, just past midnight, Griffin woke my friend in a panic, whispering that someone was outside the camper. The first sound they heard was a soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, followed by loud pounding on the door. The dread was palpable. My friend quickly fumbled for his gun, only to realize it wasn't loaded. Griffin was unarmed, and calling the police was impossible given their remote location. Both men sat frozen in fear as they heard the camper door handle rattle. The door creaked open, but not fully. Then came the long, deliberate scratching sound, as if someone were scraping a knife along the outside of the door. It felt like an eternity, but neither of them moved. Finally, my friend nodded at Griffin. He was going to check it out. He crept toward the door, flashlight shaking in his hand. Just as he reached the door, it suddenly burst open and a knife slashed across his face. The pain hit like a shockwave. My friend fell to ground, dazed, but before he could recover, a man was on top of him. The knife pressed against his neck. Another man appeared and began kicking him relentlessly in the head. Without hesitation, Griffin leapt out of the camper and tackled the man with the knife. The second man bolted into the darkness, and both disappeared into the forest. Griffin helped my friend back into the truck, and they sped off, 2 hours to the nearest hospital. The injuries were severe. His face was covered in blood, and a deep cut across his eye left him permanently damaged. They reported the attack to the police, but it was like nothing had happened. No arrests, no investigations. The scars were the only reminders left of that night. 2 weeks later, when the rest of the logging crew finished the job, they discovered one of their co-workers. He had been bound, gagged, raped, and murdered, left in a ditch. Since then, my friend's father has never been the same. His right eye, scarred and damaged, is a constant reminder of the horrors he faced that night. The sounds from that night, the eerie silence when the radio went dead, haunt him to this day. As for me, I've never been able to forget the story. The fear of the deep woods has taken root in my soul. I haven't heard from my friend or his father in years, and I can only hope they're doing all right. A part of me still fears that the darkness they encountered on that mountain hasn't let them go, that it still lurks out there,